Welcome to Capitol Preview, a weekly bipartisan discussion with Iowa legislators about the key issues facing our state. Brought to you by Mediacom.
Good morning and welcome to another segment of Capitol Preview. I'm Bill Peard, your host. Our guest today on Capitol Preview is Representative Pat Grassley, Republican from New Hartford, Iowa. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. It's good to see you. Why don't you tell us a little bit, Pat, of what district you represent, and then why did you run for office?
Well, I currently represent House District 50 in the legislature. As most people probably know, we each represent in the House 30,000 people. So my district is southern Butler County, all of Grundy County, and the northern half of Hardin County. Every 10 years we have redistricting, so obviously we each change our districts. Those of us in rural Iowa have found our districts to be a little bit larger every time we have the new census maps come out. So the district I had previously was much more compact. So like I said, when you look at rural Iowa in the legislative maps, we each have to represent 30,000 people, and that area is really starting to expand to the number of counties we represent. And as far as just why I ran for office is, I've been around politics obviously my entire life. I grew up around it, never really was around the political end of things. Just remember, a lot of conversations around the dinner table, being a part of different announcements and campaign things that my grandfather was at. And so going to those all the time, just something you grew up around. I don't know if I was necessarily actively involved in it at the time, but it was something that was close to me, and I farm as well, and so it's something like you grow up around. I grew up around the family farm. I grew up around politics as well, and it was just something that I kind of just picked up on. In fact, when I first started getting involved in politics or being interested, my grandfather read about it in the newspaper, actually, that I was going to be involved in something at the University of Northern Iowa, actually. So he obviously says that it wasn't something that I knew I'd always wanted to do. It was something I just kind of, as I got older, had more interest in.
So Pat, why don't we, since we're kind of at that area, why don't you talk about who your grandpa is for the viewers that may not make that connection, and tell us a little bit about maybe some fun things that you.
I should have probably touched on that. I just assumed, because that's one thing growing up around it. My grandfather was elected to the Senate, Chuck Grassley, in 1980. I was born in 1983. So for me personally, I don't know any different. A lot of people ask, what's it like having a grandfather that's a senator or whatever, and that's why I always say my grandpa or whatever. I refer to him as that because he's always been my grandpa. I mean, he didn't just all of a sudden become a United States Senator. I think actually that would be more difficult. Growing up around it, being around it all the time, I think was it was just natural. I think it would be much more difficult being a 18, 19, 20, even a 25-year-old, and all of a sudden you're just thrust into the public spotlight and people are watching what you want to do. But knowing that it's something that I've always been a part of, it's just my grandpa, and I always tell everyone, because a lot of people will say, you're doing this because your grandpa expects you to do it, or you get elected because your grandpa. And I tell everyone, we go to events and things together, but it's no different than if a grandfather and a grandson like to fish together. I mean, it's something we both enjoy. It's something we both like to do, and we'll be at events together, and people will assume, well, Pat and Chuck are just there to. Pat's running for something. Well, a lot of times it's just because it's something we both enjoy to do. Absolutely. And it's just convenient that we happen to be there together, too. So, that's a lot of it. And I tell everyone when we're having those conversations, a lot of people think that there's these conversations, who's going to run for what and running all this. I say a lot of the times when my grandfather and I are driving to the next event, or we're just talking about how the crops are looking in the field, or maybe what's going on at home, or picking up pop cans. I mean, gas mileage, just things that you just would typically talk about with a grandfather, right? Those are the kind of interactions we have probably just as much, if not more, than the political conversations as well.
Well, and you have a connection there too. Are you serving in his seat? Did he run for a House seat?
And actually, when I was first elected, I was 23 years old. I was actually older than he was when he was first elected, but he was elected to the legislature in 1959, and so he was from Butler County. He's actually one of my constituents now. So that's kind of a fun thing I tell everyone too. Senator Grassley is my constituent, but that's why we're at things together in the district. But also, yes, he did represent most of my current district. The old district I had before redistricting, he represented basically all of that. So when I ran the first time in that old district that I represented, that was a district that he represented. And it actually is interesting to meet some folks in the community that say, I remember, this is kind of an interesting story. So I run into people that will say, I remember when your grandfather first ran. Well, some people, if you're from far away from New Hartford, it's when he ran for the United States Senate.
Right.
And then you have conversations with people that say, I remember when he first ran, and they maybe live in Mason City. Well, that was when he ran for Congress. And then I meet people in Butler and Grundy County that say, I remember when your grandfather first ran, and they're talking about 1959 for the Iowa legislature. Those are the people that have been the hardcore supporters that have been around with my grandfather since the late 50s. And those are really the fun stories to get to hear. That as a grandson, those are some of the things that I'll remember, is hearing people talk about stories like that from how he progressed through and things like that.
Well, it's a proud tradition. I mean, the Grassleys are very well respected people, so that's kind of that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of neat how the baton has been passed to you for state politics. So tell me a little bit. Let's just keep on that vein. What committees are you serving on?
I currently serve on the Ways and Means Committee, the Economic Growth Committee, and I also serve on the Commerce Committee, but then I chair the Agriculture Committee. And obviously, like I touched on a little bit earlier, I farm. My dad's the farmer's son to my grandfather. There's 5 children that my grandparents have. My dad's the middle. He's the farmer's son. He doesn't get involved in politics, but he manages the family farm. So I work with him and my grandfather doing that. And then also my background, so it is in agriculture, and so when the opportunity came about to be the chair of the Agriculture Committee, I was very excited when the Speaker gave me the opportunity to do that, because I chaired the Economic Growth Committee for 2 years before I was assigned to the Agriculture Committee as chair, which I enjoyed doing and I learned a lot doing it, but as far as what I'm naturally involved in or naturally interested in, the Agriculture Committee fits me perfully, and I'm really excited to do this. Is my second term as chair of the committee.
It is Iowa, Yeah. So you kind of have touched base on this, but I'm going to give you a chance if you have anything else. So what do you do when you're not in Des Moines?
Yeah.
And it looks like you're going to be in Des Moines for a while.
Yeah. Well, we might. Yeah, it depends. Hopefully we get to farm again and we all go back home. I tell everyone, as far as the legislative session, 2 things speed up the legislative session: the weather outside and planning progress back home, because we have quite a few farmers in the legislature, especially in the House Republican caucus.
This week's going to be a big week.
That's exactly right.
So for a whole week,
there's going to be a lot of folks that are ready to itching just to get back home and get things in the ground, because technically the session is supposed to end this week. But for me personally, we farm, we raise livestock, we bottle feed baby Holstein calves, raise those as feeder cattle and sell those, and then we farm 1,700 acres of corn and soybeans between my grandfather, my dad, and I. And like I said, my dad manages that, and I rent some of my own, have the livestock, and work with them as well.
It's a good thing you're young, because you got lots of stuff to do.
Yeah.
You probably don't get much sleep this time of year.
No, and my wife and I, we have 3 children, so I also have a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, and then we also have an 8-month-old. So as far as the sleep goes, the 8-month-old has much more effect on the sleep than the farming in the legislature does.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there priorities on the Ag Committee that I know you're the chair of it, are there some priorities that you want to focus on?
What we've focused on in the Agriculture Committee is beginning farmer legislation. That was when I was first elected and when I was first appointed chair of the committee. I made that a priority, so we've continued to focus on that. But what I've done this year is focused on a lot of what we have in Iowa as far as like commodity groups. So a lot of the commodities have groups that members pay in a due or a fee to keep those organizations going, and they promote the products across the state. So we took time this session to have all those groups come in and tell their story. What I've told people as far as agriculture and what we deal with in the state of Iowa, one of the biggest problems we're going to face long term is the fact that we have a lot of folks growing up that don't spend any time on the farm. So you're seeing a lot of issues come from that. I think you're seeing similar things down here in Des Moines, the Des Moines Water Works, some of the things, those conversations that have stemmed from that. Also folks, just not understanding how livestock is raised in rural Iowa, or how we implement farming practices. And so we've spent a lot of time just trying to promote agriculture as a committee, because a lot of legislation that happens with agriculture is at federal level, and we've obviously passed several good pieces of legislation, beginning farmer, also dealing with manure and pesticide management, things like that. But I think as chair of the committee, I feel like my responsibility is to promote agriculture and tell the story of the good things we do in the state, because you're having, for the first time in Iowa, generations of children growing up and becoming consumers that have never spent any time on grandma and grandpa's farm, or their aunt and uncle's farm, or mom and dad's farm. And I think long term in the state of Iowa, that's probably the biggest challenge we face in agriculture. Now, we have several others, but just as far as public perception and that disconnect that hopefully we can continue to shrink. That's something that I think we need to be addressing in the agriculture community as a whole, not just legislatively.
So health-wise, do you think the state of ag is in good shape in Iowa?
Well, I think you're seeing, we're seeing some slowdown in the as far as the commodity prices, and you're seeing that affect a lot of different areas in the state, whether it's the state budget for revenue. I think you're going to continue to see that possibly pay an impact. But I think overall, I think guys have had some successful years. Guys and men and women, I should say, farm families have had some successful years in the past couple years. Hopefully what you've seen is a lot of folks preparing for situations like we may be going into here over the next year or two, where the cost of production is fairly high compared to the price of what the livestock and grain is worth. And hopefully you guys have been prepared for that and found themselves in a position where they can withstand a year or maybe a year and a half or whatever it is of things being a little bit tighter, because like I said, we're coming off some record high prices, some record high crop yields. And so I think long term, I think a lot of farmers have projected that into what they're doing moving forward. The ones that haven't may find themselves in a position that's an unfavorable position to be in, but some of that is also self-induced as well.
Right, exactly. But I mean, that is as old as the state is, that scenario.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
So what do you think some of the issues facing our state is when it comes to our budget?
Yeah, well, I think when you're looking at our budget, I think this year you've heard a lot of conversations. We've been fairly fortunate in the state of Iowa to have the revenues that we've had. And I think we're finding ourselves in a position right now where there's a lot of stresses on our budget, and I mean that from the standpoint of expenditures that we have to come up with. If you look at Medicaid, you're looking at $200 million increase over last year. We have to fully fund our property tax backfill that we've passed when we had property tax reform. We've made commitments to education. And in our state budget, we have $180 million of the new revenue that we're working with right now up at the Capitol. And the needs on that are almost 3 times what that number is. So you're going to have to find cuts in the budget. And I tell everyone that, when we talk about education funding, for example, the number that we're committing to education over the last 5 years has actually been higher than what the rate of revenue growth to the state of Iowa. So for a lot of folks that are saying we're not increasing funding education, if you look at over the last 5 years, we've made a tremendous investment. We've made a tremendous investment in reducing the property tax burden on Iowans and fully funding our tax credits that we have for the property tax credits that we have as well. So we've had to meet those responsibilities. Plus we're running into a situation from the federal government where the Medicaid match from the feds that we get has decreased every year, which puts Iowa in a position where we now have to come up with $200 million inside of our Medicaid budget. Well, if you go over $200 million with Medicaid, $100 million with education, and you're looking at over $100 million with property tax, and you only have $180 million with the new revenue, I'm just a farmer, but I can tell you how that math works out, and it doesn't work very well. So I tell everyone, a lot of places in our budgets, a lot of the budget segments are going to see actual cuts, not the type of cuts they talk about in Washington where no increase is a cut. I'm talking true cuts to budgets. Yeah. So I tell everyone, if you're folks that are receiving some increases in funding, we need to look at that and say, okay, we got to look at the budget as a whole, because it's easy to say we need more money for X, Y, and Z, but if you don't look at the actual budget as a whole, the $7.2 billion we have to spend, that picture doesn't match with what the wants and then what we have available to spend.
Very good. Well, we appreciate your time here, Representative Grassley. I can see that Iowa's in good hands, so we appreciate your work at the legislature. We appreciate you coming in here and answering the questions that Iowans want to know.
Yep.
So, again, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Keep going.
I will.
So, thank you. Our next segment, we have Senator Matt McCoy, Democrat from Des Moines. Thank you again for joining us here on Capitol Preview.